But how do we find prehistoric evidence of control of disease and infection? It's really difficult. We're looking at, again, archaeologic remains, usually skeletal, and no story that goes with it. We have to infer, based on trying to interpret the surrounding environment, the materials found around the skeleton, just what occurred. Fortunately for us, we do have a few rare examples of prehistoric human beings, or even prehistoric Neanderthal, that gives us an idea of what might have been occurring or how they lived. And one excellent example is a mummified remains or mummified human being that's been nicknamed the Iceman, Otzi. There are definitely signs in this mummy of possible kinds and types of infection or parasites. And the actual mere existence of this mummy has given us an incredible amount of information just from one individual. Would it be possible that we could find other similar types of remains? That would be a wonderful addition to our knowledge of how our prehistoric ancestors survived and thrived. Otzi, of course, you might know the story, was discovered in 1991 in the snow high up in the Swiss Alps, and was originally thought to be a contemporary human being, but fairly quickly was discovered that this was no typical person. This was the mummified remains of one of our ancestors. And what was fortunate is that his material, his clothing and his garb and all of his equipment was nearby the skeletal remains. The skeleton itself had moved some during the freeze-thaw or the glaciation or movement of any of the snowpack that was around him or ice that was around him, but it was close enough that they could find his little shoes, and his coat, and his cloak, and his leggings. It's an amazing discovery and a rich source of information about how this individual lived roughly 5,000 years ago. Every so often, Otzi is evaluated. In fact, a whole museum, a whole facility has been established to preserve this very precious resource. And proper environmental controls are maintained, as well as scientific study and evaluation of all of the materials that belong to this fellow. We can see that he was well equipped for his environment, and in fact several recreations, at least one in particular, where someone has simulated his clothing and tried to see just how sturdy the materials were, have been done. And some interesting stories, or you could find some different presentations about Otzi and what we speculate was part of his life experience. Some of the most unusual findings that occurred with this mummified remain included some of his tools. He had a copper axe that still included the wooden handle. Now, most of those copper axes that had been discovered by scientists or archaeologists were simply the copper blade all by itself, because most of the time the wooden handle would disintegrate. But because it was in a frozen environment and it was preserved, even the leather bindings that held the blade in place attached to the handle were still present. So scientists were able to study how the axe itself was constructed. Not only that, by the time they determined the age of this mummified remain, which is roughly 5,300 years ago, they realized that the fact that he had a copper axe turned back the clock on the Copper Age in that part of Europe at least 1,000 years or so. So he, just as one single individual, contributed an amazing amount of information just to our knowledge of how our ancestors, at least this individual, and his everyday affairs and his everyday equipment survived and went about his business. Some other unusual findings are on the mummified remains itself. We now know, at least the current count, is that Otzi had about 61 tattoos on his body. They were in key locations, often articulations or joints, that you could not see because they were under his clothing. They were on his back, in what you would think of as the lumbar region. They were on the back of his knee, on the side of his leg, on his calf, on his inner knee, on his ankle, on his chest. They were often in linear patterns of lines, and they were definitely tattoos that had sources of carbon in them. They had a little bit of a blue tint, and as near as we can determine, again, because you couldn't see these because they were under his clothes, it's speculated that they were not there for ornamental reasons, but instead for something else. What was that something else? Well, perhaps that reason, or the reason that Otzi had these tattoos, was more medical than ornamental. Now, we really don't know for sure. I mean, they could have been done for some kind of spiritual or mystical reason. However, when we take a look at the location where these parallel lines of tattoos occurred, it was determined that there was a serious coincidence, because the location of these tattoos on Otzi's mummified remains coincided significantly with the location of acupuncture points and Chinese acupuncture procedures or medicine. In fact, some of these sites are spot on. They're exactly the same locale. So, is this coincidence, or is this something else? What's also interesting is that Otzi had pierced ears. And human beings, even today, are still very interested in body piercing. This appears to be something that human beings, for both tattooing and piercing, human beings have been doing it for thousands of years. One of the unique tattoos that wasn't a linear arrangement of parallel lines was an X or plus-shaped tattoo on his left ankle. There was also another plus-shaped tattoo on his inner knee. These are actual classic sites for acupuncture points and are used to treat different kinds of abnormalities of those joints. There's even a specific site where he has a tattoo that associates or is also aligned with an acupuncture point that would treat a condition of the lower spine. Oftentimes where we have that backache from lifting and carrying heavy objects. That's where Otzi also suffered from a type of arthritic condition, would want to have some kind of help, because he did a lot of lifting and carrying as well. In terms of his abdominal contents, studies of his abdominal or intestinal contents revealed that he did have an intestinal parasite, actually several, and one of his little bags of materials that he carried with him included different medicinal plants and fungi and mosses. He had medicinal mushrooms that were used to treat certain kinds of conditions, or could be used, I should say. He had mosses that he could use like a band-aid or a bandage. He had charcoal, and in fact, the contents of his intestine showed that about 25% of his intestinal contents was charcoal, which is a good purifier. Even today, it's not uncommon to use activated charcoal if we're trying to clean out someone who's ingested some kind of toxic material. They might use activated charcoal to absorb that material and remove it from that person's stomach. Now, was this a coincidence or not? We'd like to think it isn't. We really can't determine that one way or another at this point. But if it was, in fact, an example of ancient treatment for different body conditions with these tattooing sites, and for whatever reason how they were performed, or if there were significant additional treatments to those locations, that would indicate that this type of pressure point treatment or acupuncture treatment predated the Chinese procedure about 2,200 years. Was this an independent invention? It's hard to say. Is this an indication that there was some kind of exchange of knowledge and information between Europe and East Asia thousands of years earlier than we thought had occurred? That seems possibly more likely, because today there's new technology and new discoveries of interaction between Europe and the Far East long before we thought that had ever occurred. And of course, it definitely indicates that body art probably began as a source of medical treatment long before human beings were using it as simply ornamental.